Well, thank you very much for inviting me to come and speak this morning. It's true, I've been busy this week. It's in one way, it's very flattering to have big audiences come and listen to me talk, both here and Brasilia on Wednesday. On the other hand, it reflects the fact that people are interested and concerned about the problems with corruption in the country. So I shouldn't be too proud of myself. I should be taking this as an indication that there is concern and worry, and that's actually good, right? I mean, given the background facts of the matter, that there's a lot of interest in thinking through this topic, which is a large topic with a lot of different pieces to it. It's not just one little thing. It's also a topic where, because corruption is, the word is a bad word, right? People want to apply it to everything out there, all kinds of bad things. And of course, there are a lot of undesirable things going on, but that label isn't necessarily helpful in all areas. But we can talk about that. So as Sergio mentioned, the second edition of my book is now available. The easiest way for you to get it, if you're interested, is through Kindle. To go on Amazon through Kindle, where you can just, as you sit here, you can just even download it, right? And that's actually one of the cheapest ways to get it. There's also...
Please pay attention to that.
That's right, yeah. And there's a paperback, and then if you've got a nice library budget, there's also a hardback available also. And revising, the first edition was published in 1999. This new edition was published just this spring. And since 99, there's been a huge outpouring of research on this topic, which is, as you would understand, a difficult topic to research because both sides to the corrupt deal want to keep it secret. And so getting good data sources is difficult, and we can talk a bit about that later if some of you are interested. We have there are cross-country indices, as you know, through Transparency International and the World Bank, which are very aggregated measures of attitudes. It's called the Corruption Perceptions Index, is what people perceive as it being a problem. And I think it's capturing something, if it's a low number. I also want to be clear, these indices are used gymnastic scoring, kind of appropriate for the Olympics, right? 10 is good, right? And 1 is bad. So keep that in mind. But it's capturing, you're using one number. So China has one number, Brazil has one number. Well, you're living here, you realize that there's some sectors of the economy that have particular problems with corruption, and others that probably operate pretty well, that don't have much corruption. And I'm an old microeconomist. I never really understood macroeconomics. It's too aggregated. That I like to really be able to look inside particular markets, particular sectors, and try to understand what are the incentives for people to engage in corruption. So I urge you to read the book, but we're going to kind of jump in, not exactly in the middle, but kind of partway through, to look at ways to think about reducing incentives and increasing costs. So it's the idea of, let's leave the criminal law prosecutions to one side. I by no means don't want to deny their importance. It's very important. I'm very supportive of what your independent prosecutors are doing. Very important that there not be a sort of a sense of impunity among people engaged in corruption, and that there's some credible possibility that they're going to be prosecuted. But that's just a background within which I think reformers need to be thinking. There are now, as I'm sure you all know, proposals, some of them coming from the prosecutors themselves, to reform that criminal law system in ways to make it kind of function better. Seems like you've got some problems in the way it functions. But in addition to that, you need to think about what is it that people are buying when they pay a bribe, right? They're buying something. They're getting something from it. The way I got involved in it, actually, as an economist, was to say, look, this is something that sort of market-like. It's a quid pro quo trade in which there's a willing seller and a willing buyer. What are they buying? What is being sold? And one way to think about reform is in taking actions that limit the the scope for these kinds of transfers by redesigning the way public programs are operating. You can't ever get rid of those incentives, but it's a piece of what we should be talking about, and that's particularly what this chapter is talking about. There are other chapters in the book that talk about the role of the political system, and I think there's special issues here in Brazil about that, the way the political system can encourage corrupt quid pro quos, whatever coalitions of parties are in power, and also to talk about ways of increasing transparency and accountability of the way in which the public sector operates. But let's concentrate for a while on this set of things. All right. Let me move over so I can see what I'm having you look at. This is just a very simple schematic. And look, there's something scarce. There's something that's valuable and scarce, and some people with power. Oh, I guess that's sorry. I need the mic. Oh, I see this is. Oh, okay. Is my head in front of that? No. All right. Contribute to corruption. This is really what I was just saying. So there's some basic insights from microeconomics that can help think about the way of structuring reforms. Oh my! My co-author is a creative producer of PowerPoint. So when when it moves around, that's her, which is great. I'm down to the old black and white little charts. But okay, so here we have a little thing here, right? So I want to talk about some of these, if you can read this, kinds of reforms in more detail. Eliminating programs, or even turning what were illegal payments into legal fees for something, reforming the structure of public programs, thinking about procurement reform, and then thinking about whether privatization is an anti-corruption strategy, or maybe even something that increases corruption along some dimensions. This you probably can't see. And so we need to think about it as a the important thing about corruption is there's a person paying the bribe and a person receiving the bribe, or kickback or payback or whatever you want to say. And it means that you can find out about it from either side. If you can get either one of them to reveal what's going on, you can find out about it. It also means that you can control it either through reducing the incentives on the demand side what I mean by demand side is demand for the things you get from paying bribes. The things that may create incentives for paying bribes, or there are regulations that are very costly, there are taxes that you think are high, there are rules that are very complex and hard to get through. You want to reduce competition. There's too much competition, and you don't like it. And then government letting out contracts and distributing resources of various kinds. Then on the other side, and the people who are responding to people's demand for reduced benefits from the government can be incentivized to act by having discretion to make choices. They actually the program is set up so they have alternatives to what they can do. Their wages may be very low, and so they justify it and say, well, I can't really live with these low wages. This, of course, not the case in some of your great big corruption cases going on. Those guys are not low-paid people. Low professionalism. One of the deterrents of corruption can be that you have gotten socialized into a professional norm of action as a lawyer, as an accountant, as an architect, and the converse of that can be make you willing to be corrupt. Low levels of monitoring, so you think you have impunity, and low punishments. Low levels of basically accountability, and a lack of transparency about what's going on, so you can think that outsiders won't find out what you're doing. We have this last one called corrupt culture. We might talk a little bit about that later if you want. I come out of economics, so I'm a little skeptical of arguments that are too heavily based on culture, to the extent that they are, what can you do? It's just our culture. Right? I said I had an Argentine person tell me, we're all descended from smugglers. So, we can't, what can you expect of us? And that was several generations back, right? So I don't mean that there can't be an attitude that this is just okay, or doing, and that needs to be broken, but that it's not the end of the story. It's not like a kind of a fixed end of the story. So let's talk about elimination or legalization. So there may be some programs out there, I guess to step back a second. One thing you can think of doing, suppose there's corruption in the in a public utility sector or an education sector. Well, what reformers need to do is look carefully at that sector, right? The particular details of how that sector works, right? How are textbooks purchased? How is admission to selective schools operate? How are teachers selected and paid, right? So there can be a range of different ways in which corrupt incentives are creative. But there might be some kind of regulatory programs which fit into the category of simple red tape, right? Now, people who don't like regulations want to call everything red tape, and I want to resist that reaction, right? There's lots of good, positive reasons why governments need to regulate for the environment, for health and safety, for labor rights, all kinds of things that are good reasons for government to regulate. And there, the question is reforming those programs so that the incentives are less. But there may be some rules and regulations out there that say have to do with foreign trade, that have to do with construction licenses, where one policy response is look through all the regulations and see if there's some that just shouldn't be there, that just are not serving any purpose, or that would only serve a purpose if there were no corruption. Right? You might have this nice, perfect world where you want, say, in taxes. You want to have a nice, complicated tax system that responds to different abilities to pay, but in practice, it's very hard to administer it without corruption creeping in. Well, that can be an argument in favor of a much more simple tax system that is easier to administer and where it's more transparent if somebody has gotten around the rules. And then in this question of reducing some kinds of programs, limiting the size of some kinds of programs that produce corruption, you've got to worry you don't do the reverse, right? So that's this, if you just reduce the budgets of something, right? If you just say, okay, you've got to do your same job but with a lower budget, and you just have to work harder. Then the corrupt incentives actually go up if we reduce the supply of something. Or there's the old problem of in English we often talk about a squishing a balloon, right? You push the balloon in one place to kind of get rid of corruption, it pops out, somewhere else. That people find other ways around things. So that any reform needs to think about how would people who want to get around it, try to do it. Sorry, these are a little too small. Let me go back one thing for a second. Did we just talk for a minute about legalizing something which has taken the form of bribes? That, of course, there's a scarce service that supposes being allocated through corruption, say places in public housing. Say and this is how I got interested in corruption. Actually, in the U.S., we have many public housing programs, but they're not sufficient to cover the households whose incomes are low enough to qualify for the program. So many more people qualifying for the program than places available in the program. Well, that would not be a situation in which you'd want to sell off, the right to live in public housing to the high bidders, because of course the people who you want to benefit from the program are not going to be the high bidders. They're going to be the poor people, right? So the allocation mechanism for public housing needs to be based on you could have a lottery. You could think of ways to do it that wouldn't have this willingness to pay criteria, kind of built in, and something like some kind of a random system, which we've done sometimes for our immigration stuff, is something worth thinking about, or some other kind of streamlining the application process with transparency about who gets things. But suppose there's a program that is simply meant to benefit business. So some countries might have a restriction on the import of capital goods. Good economists don't like that. There should be free trade in capital goods, but suppose there's not. Right? Well, the capital goods should go to the firms that will value them the most. And who are they? They're probably the ones who, in a legal system, would pay the most for them. Not necessarily in a corrupt system, because there might be some corrupt businesses, honest businesses, who won't pay bribes, to get this thing. So that's, I think, an example of something where there may be a public benefit, the state may have this policy in place of trying to limit imports, but selling it off to the high bidder does not undermine the basic purpose of the program, and the government gets some resources from it at the same time. So I've given this example before. In the US, if you want to get your passport fast, you pay for it. You don't pay the bureaucrat for it. You pay the US Department of State for it, passport office for it. And of course you make some other people wait longer. That's always the problem of paying to get to the head of the queue, is other people have to wait longer. But those are the guys who are the plan ahead guys, right? The people who can think a month in advance that they're going to need to travel. So it's a cost, but it seems like in that case a tolerable cost. So it's something that needs to be in the toolkit. But then there's ways of reforming public programs to sort of limit the rents, available rents in the economic sense of rents. The kind of profits that could be taken in some corrupt division of the gains between the officials and the beneficiaries of the program. So some of these I think are pretty obvious. If you have corruption in the collection of taxes, why does that happen? It happens because one way it happens is because there's some discretion available to the tax collector to decide how much taxes you're supposed to be paying. So you could simplify the revenue collection, widen the tax base so that you might be able to lower the rates, fewer gradations in the tax system. Generally, a flat tax is a pretty awful idea, but for all kinds of distributive justice reasons. But some kind of simplification in a corrupt system can make some sense. And while I really said this before, the regulation is something that needs to be looked at in terms of what the gains are to society from these regulatory efforts. And we're not necessarily talking about less regulation, just regulation that is easier and more transparent to carry out. Right. There's a lot of discussion of, and we talk a little bit about it in the new edition, about e-governance. And making benefits available, simplifying, improving accountability. I think this is a promising thing to look at for some of you younger people out here who are really much more into this than me. But we shouldn't be too starry-eyed about it. I mean, I think there are certainly ways in which modern technology can be used to check about to monitor what's happening. We see now this is not corruption, but we see in the U.S. the importance of policemen carrying cameras to record any violence that would record their actions, so that could be they could be disciplined for that, and as well as outsiders, taking videos of things going on. But there are also ways in which to use internet portals to lower discretion in areas where there's quite a lot of corruption. That if you think there's corruption in, say, paying traffic fines because it's the policeman there who is taking the bribe, well, if the payments can all be done in an impersonal way through an internet portal, that may help. these are not perfect things, but they're kind of ways of they're doing two things, right? They're making it easier to see that something's gone wrong, and they're also making it less of a hassle to actually obey the law, because one way that corruption comes out is the policeman will say, yeah, we'll take you down to the police station, you can do all this stuff, but we can just settle this here, right, for some lower amount. Well, there's still the lower amount problem, but if what they do is they say, here's your ticket, and you just go on the internet and pay it. You pay it, and you pay it in a day or two. It'll be relatively cheap. If you wait a little longer, it'll go up. You're giving people. You're just trying to tilt the incentives in the direction of obeying the rules. This is really so you can't read it. But let me talk about So this is talking about ways of reforming the public programs themselves so that the rents are less. And therefore, because the rents are less, if there's some chance of being caught, there'll be less willingness to pay bribes. Let's talk a bit about procurement reform, and where I understand there's a lot of the discussion here in Brazil has to do with corruption in public procurement. And that's obviously an extraordinarily important area to be concerned about. And I think it's important to distinguish between things that require very specialized research and development, such as a newly designed military aircraft, something like that, right? Now, in some of these areas, Brazil is probably not a R&D innovator. You're probably buying very often for your military or for other kinds of things that have already been invented somewhere else. So that makes it a little bit easier, because the thing that can help is to have some kind of a benchmarking that you could do internationally, that you can see, well, how much are other people paying? Now, maybe there's corruption everywhere, but at least you're not having more, than other people have. So, and there are organizations that track public contracting, particularly in the military, but in other areas around the world. So some kind of benchmarking is possible. There's a very nice study that was done in Italy, trying to kind of infer corruption from data on the relationship between the government budget in particular regions, spending on roads and on hospital beds, and getting a kind of a rough measure of productivity. Given how much money was spent, what did they get in terms of physical benefits out of the payment? Making some corrections for things like it's a lot hillier and it's a lot more expensive to build roads in some places than in others. They couldn't do this perfectly. These are just kind of rough calculations. They found that the least productive public money was in the south of Italy, and the part of Italy that's the poorest, right, compared to the north, which raises, of course, a kind of a paradox and a problem, right? You don't want to just say, well, they should never build any roads in the south of Italy because it's more corrupt, right? And that's going to be a problem, that there often is an association between regions. I don't know if this is true in Brazil, but regions where income is low, there's a lot of poverty, and there may be, in the Italian case, mafias, or if not mafias, at least sort of oligarchs who are running things, and so there's a special problem in dealing with this. But at least it's highlighting it, it's putting a burden of proof on the people who are arguing that this much has to be paid, making it possible to do a certain amount of benchmarking for things. So those are for things where the actual thing you're buying is not like a brand new military aircraft. There's going to be a special problem when you really want independent R&D to happen, or something very specialized, to something like roads and hospitals that are where the technology is not fancy, and you can at least through comparisons see where things have gone, where at least there's a burden should be a burden of proof on the contracting officials and the firms to demonstrate that these prices made some sense. The other thing is, of course, sometimes governments can just go shopping. I mean, literally shopping. In other words, they don't have to go through some complicated contracting process And they may be required, I think, too often to have to go through some kind of a sealed bidding, contracting process, when actually they could just go to the store. For office equipment, for ordinary cars, for things that ordinary people are buying, either domestically or in the international market, and that's the benchmarking, the prices that things are sold for in an ordinary private market. It may mean the government has to not buy the absolute special, wonderful thing that they love, but put up with something more generic that is available to other people. Yale University, for example, has I don't know that they were corrupt, but they had a version of this, which was they now allow our purchasing people for office supplies to go to a chain called Staples, which is a kind of you have it here, you're nodding your heads, basically a budget chain of business supply. And you have to justify that you needed to buy paper for the computers or that you needed to buy pens. That the basic thing you're buying would have to be justified. But you just were allowed to go off and use the prices determined in that store as the price that you were paying for this thing. And so it suggests that one way of thinking about corruption in contracting is to think about what's being bought, right? And to ask whether there are vulnerabilities in the things that are being bought that could be reduced by some change in what is actually being bought. And then secondly, this is this question of evaluating contractors in terms of what they produce. That is a time problem here, right? But rather than sort of what they have put into this, and suggesting that the contracting agencies define the outcomes carefully. Now you have special problems. I know, I've been in the run up to the Olympics. There were, not surprisingly, all kinds of Schadenfreude stories in the press. Oh, they'll never get it done in time, but it seems like things are pretty much okay. From what I was even watching people rowing this morning in the Rio Bay in Rio, but there is a special problem with something that's got a deadline, right? Because it gives the contractors a special level of bargaining power vis-a-vis the state. To ask for extra payments, whereas if only they'd planned things a little better ahead of time, they wouldn't have run into this. And so those kinds of things with deadlines raise particular responsibilities on the not just the officials, the contracting officials themselves, but on whatever organizations are monitoring. You've got like a controlleria or an outside audit office to be involved as these things are going on. So just quickly, there's different elements of reform in procurement that go from the lack of discretion, the professionalism of the people engaged in the activities. And so that's I guess a question that I can't answer. But to what extent the training of people who are going to be as professionals involved in the contracting process, that part of their training involves some alertness to the risks of corruption and their own kind of whistleblowing obligations in that context. I did a little advising on an outside panel in Quebec, where there was a long-running, like decades-long-running corruption problem involving a city across the St. Lawrence from Montreal, Laval, and there was one mayor who was like the boss of the city, and there are all kinds of massive construction projects, huge corruption in it when it was finally revealed over time. Things very, very much, costing a lot, and what was striking to me in hearing descriptions of what was going on was that, the sort of very respectable lawyers, accountants, architects, who would just be like pillars of the community, who are not themselves necessarily personally corrupt. In other words, it wasn't that they were getting rich, but it's really hard to imagine that they didn't have some understanding of what was happening, right? And that, and it was only later when there was a kind of a cascade of people, revealing what was going on, that they started to say something, and that was, to me, I think, one of the most striking things, that it was that there was, in some sense, a kind of implicit collaboration of some of these people. Right? And so we've already talked about it, the importance of kind of monitoring and a kind of transparency about contracts. Right? Some jurisdictions publish all their contracts online. The European Union is good. There's actually some nice studies by a group of people based in Hungary and in the UK trying to study the EU contracts to make some inferences about ones that look risky. And very interesting work. And then they've got a great mass of data. Well, you could do this in Brazil. I think Colombia does it. I had a student from Colombia who told me they do that. I think U.S. does it to some extent, but not entirely. So they did things. They took things which were risk factors. Well, what would be a risk factor? Single source. Only one firm is bidding on something, right? Keeping the amount of the contract being just below the cutoff. The law had a cutoff that said if you contract for more than something like $500,000, then you've got to have a competitive bidding thing. But if you keep below it, you don't have to. You can do a single source thing. Well, they could look across the countries, which ones had just an amazing number of contracts that were just $100 below that cutoff. And they had a few things that are red flags that don't let you determine that particular contract is corrupt, but that say that there's a risk in the way that system is working. And finally, are the firms? Do we have some information that the firms are somehow making huge profits from these things that seem disproportionate compared to what they're doing otherwise? So I guess Brazil has been through its big privatization exercise. I don't know how much there still is available to be privatized. I know I spent a year at the World Bank in 95, 96 as a visiting scholar there, working in the Vice Presidency for Finance and Private Sector Development. And at that time, I know the World Bank was involved in advising some of the Brazilian agencies on their privatization activity. And so I know there's been a lot of that that's happened. But here the only thing I would want to say is that often privatization is defended as a way of getting rid of that corrupt public company and putting it into the private sector where everything will be fine, right? And it's not just about corruption, it's about somehow the guys you could hire in the private firm are going to be higher quality, work harder, right? But there's been not enough emphasis, I don't think, on the way that privatization should be combined with a move toward a more competitive economy. And I think the World Bank itself put too much emphasis on just getting into private hands, and not thinking about how the market was going to operate. Because if you just privatize it as a monopoly, well, for no corruption, they just get monopoly profits, right? But they also are likely to have a special relationship with the state going forward. So I think it's important to be thinking about the competitive consequences of privatization, not just the kind of putting it into private hands. Or you may just have shifted the self-dealing into the private firm in a way that may make it more difficult to get at than if the firm were still in public hands. So this is not to say that privatization is not very often an extremely desirable thing to be doing, just that there are some cautions about how that is done. And of course, the process of privatization itself can be corrupted. There's a nice book by a political scientist looking at privatization in Latin America, Luigi Manzetti, documenting some of the corruption, or at least the risks of corruption in a number of these privatizations. And notice one thing: how is the state going to? Privatization has these two things. It's trying to get the firm to work better, but it's also a way of raising revenue for the state. They sell off things because they're going to get money from it. Well, how are they going to get the most money for it? If they sell it as a monopoly, right? If you can promise the guys who buy it that they're not going to have any competitors, then they'll pay more for it. Well, that's exactly against, right, the social benefit of some kind of competition, and it's a real problem. I mean, you have plenty of cases of that happening. And of course, you've got to have be sure that there's some kind of independent, that the judiciary is independent, there's kind of some effective enforcement of the ongoing relationship between the state and the private firms. You need to be sure that you've created regulatory bodies which are themselves not just captured by those industries, and that those regulatory bodies should be professionalized. I want to give you a little. This is economics 101 here, right? This is nothing fancy, but it makes a kind of simple point. So this is a particular kind of corruption. This is a kind of corruption where there's lots of guys who are willing to pay bribes if the price is right, and lots of guys who are willing to take bribes if the price is right. So it might be some kind of a regulatory system or an allocation of some kind of scarce public services. So the x-axis is the number of corrupt transactions, not and the bribes are the price. Right? You think, sometimes people talk about this in the reverse, which seems to me weird. So, but because the bribes are just the price. Nobody's buying bribes, right? They're just the bribes that are what you're paying, right? So this is just saying, let's suppose that, holding everything else constant, that there are more people who are willing to pay bribes if the size of the bribe is lower, right? And because they're taking into account the benefits they're going to get from paying the bribe, and the less they have to pay, the more people are willing to do it. And the yellow line is the supply of bribes, which is just, this is the people on the other side, the public officials. The higher the bribe that they're going to get, the more of them are willing to make corrupt transactions. And now let's see, we have see, this is my co-author again, doing a nice what would in the past have been drawn on a blackboard. Showing you that one kind of reform, a supply-side reform, can be something where you move where the result of that reform is to reduce the supply, something that affects the behavior of the public officials by more credible enforcement, giving them some other kinds of benefits to substitute for honesty, so that the supply of bribes fall. I mean, the supply curve falls, and there's this interesting result here, right? The number of corrupt transactions falls, but the actual bribe price rises, right? The size of the bribe is higher. So you can't necessarily infer that just because the bribe goes up that something's happening here. There is a benefit, and it's pointing out the importance in this discussion of distinguishing between the size of the bribe and the number of transactions, the amount of transactions that are affected by corruption. And when we talk about the level of corruption, right, this is one of those, what does that mean, the level of corruption, right? Does it mean the size of this rectangle, right, the area of that thing, the amount, the number, the volume of bribes that are paid? Does it mean the size of the bribe? Here it looks like corruption's gone up if we just look at the size. We can't really tell from this diagram. What it looks like, maybe there's a little reduction in the volume of bribery. But the good thing that's happened is the number of corrupt transactions has fallen. If those corrupt transactions are having some consequences for the operation of the policy, you can think of it as there's some benefit for that. But now we could have this is back to the same diagram. Demand side reforms. Okay, nice, right? So we're doing something to reduce the demand for bribes. We could worry about how the demand curve, I've just moved it down, parallel, could shift around different ways, change its shape. But the point is that if the demand is falling because we've provided, say we've increased the supply of honestly, things that you can get honestly, we've increased the credibility of punishment, we've done some redesign so that fewer people are interested in trying to get the service corruptly. Now we both reduce the supply and the level of bribery. So this is a particular kind where it's sort of like a market in the sense that there are lots of payers and sellers. Oops. All right. So let me just end here because I really want to have this a discussion with you. So this is just to conclude. So there's a first the question of structural reform, and that to me is extremely important in anti-corruption, that we shouldn't get all hung up on the criminal law, which is a necessary thing to talk about, but that the discussion, particularly people with a social science and social science overlapping with law interest, should be thinking about ways to eliminate, reform, privatize, with the caveats I've been giving you, the programs where corruption seems to be having a real effect on people. And on the efficiency with which the state operates, right? So part of corruption is a transfer. Some people are getting money and other people aren't, right? That should. But part of it is a inefficiency in the way the program is working, right? Here, the public officials want to buy something in which a lot of bribes can be hidden, right? So the corrupt guys want one-of-a-kind, untransparent stuff, which may not at all fit with the needs of the state. Ordinary garden variety corruption in the bureaucracy, which the people who pay the bribes say, "Oh, I had to do it. You know, it was so messy and so complicated. I just had to do it." Well, first of all, take that with a grain of salt. But secondly, the public officials themselves may seek to create more red tape, right? Because they can gain from it. So you want to limit that kind of incentive. Procurement reform we've already really talked about as another way of thinking about reducing corrupt payoffs. Okay, so I don't think I have anything more. Yeah, all right. So thank you. I would like to hear from you.